the air in the Great Smoky Mountains holds its breath. In the autumn of 1912, a year after the last word was ever heard from Black Creek Camp, a lone trapper named Jedediah Stone was checking his lines deep in a section of woods the Cherokee had long called Utlanta, the place of the spearfinger. It was a forbidden place, a crease in the ancient map of the world where shadows clung to the trees a little too tightly, where the silence felt less like peace and more like a predator waiting. Jedediah was not a man given to flights of fancy. His world was one of iron traps, animal hides, and the brutal, simple logic of survival. But even he could not deny the profound wrongness that saturated the soil beneath his worn leather boots. He smelled it first, not the familiar, earthy scent of decay, but something sharper, acrid, the smell of bleached bone and old, cold iron. He followed the scent past colossal hemlocks and through thickets of rhododendron that clawed at his clothes, until he stumbled into a small, unnaturally clear clearing. And there, half buried in a season's worth of fallen leaves, was a human femur. It was stark white against the dark earth, and even from a distance, Jedediah could see the deep, parallel gouges scoring its surface. They were not the ragged marks of a bear or a cougar. They were clean, precise, and horrifyingly familiar. They were the marks of a machine. Jedediah stood frozen, the cold mountain air doing little to stop the sweat beading on his brow. His gaze lifted from the single bone and swept across the clearing. It was then that the true, macabre scale of the scene revealed itself. The clearing was not a clearing. It was a grave, a shallow, unmarked, and brutally desecrated one. Everywhere he looked, fragments of humanity littered the forest floor. A shattered ribcage here, a piece of a skull there, a disarticulated hand with its bony fingers curled as if grasping for something that was no longer there. There was no order to it. It was a chaotic scattering of remains, as if the men they once belonged to had been disassembled, thrown away like so much refuse. This was not the work of nature. Nature, in all its red-toothed cruelty, was at least efficient. This was something else. This was an act of annihilation. He counted what he could, trying to make sense of the horrifying tableau. He saw evidence of at least a dozen individuals, maybe more. The sheer volume was staggering. Who were these men? And what unspeakable thing had happened in this God-forsaken corner of the mountains that could reduce them to this? He backed away slowly, his trapper's instincts screaming at him. He didn't look for tracks. He didn't try to piece together the puzzle. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than any winter wind, that this was a place where answers were dangerous. This was the final, horrifying resting place of the 32 miners from Black Creek Camp. A year-long mystery had just found its ending, but in doing so, it had given birth to a far darker, more disturbing legend. To understand the horror discovered by Jedediah Stone, we must go back. Back to the spring of 1911. The Gilded Age was dying and the Progressive Era was dawning, but in the remote, fog-shrouded hollows of the Great Smoky Mountains, time moved differently. Here, industry was a raw, brutal beast, clawing its way into the ancient wilderness in search of coal, timber, and copper. The Appalachian Ore and Timber Company was one such beast, a faceless entity from Knoxville with deep pockets and a thirst for the rich veins of copper rumored to run through the mountains like arteries of green fire. They established a remote prospecting camp deep in uncharted territory, miles from the nearest road or settlement. They called it Black Creek Camp. It was a name that would, in time, become a whisper of warning, a byword for a horrifying and forbidden mystery. 32 men were hired for the job. They were a mix of hardened local mountaineers who knew the woods, desperate immigrants from Wales and Italy who knew the mines, and young men simply looking for a wage in a hard world. They were led by a foreman named Silas Kane, a veteran of the Colorado Silver Rush, a man with a face like a roadmap of failures, and a reputation for pushing his crews to their absolute limit. They were promised good pay and a hefty bonus if they struck the legendary Devil's Vein, a seam of pure copper so rich it was spoken of in hushed, almost mythical tones by old prospectors. They marched into the wilderness with mules laden with tools, dynamite, and enough provisions for 6 months. They were swallowed by the vast, indifferent green of the Appalachian forest. And then, they vanished from the face of the earth. Life at Black Creek Camp was, by all accounts, a grueling existence. The men worked from sunup to sundown, their days a punishing rhythm of pickaxe swings, dynamite blasts, and the backbreaking labor of hauling rock from the hungry maw of the earth. The mountains were an omnipresent force, both provider and warden. The forest supplied them with game and timber, but it also hemmed them in, a dense and suffocating wilderness that seemed to watch them with a primeval intelligence. Letters sent out with the bi-weekly supply runner paint a picture of isolation and creeping unease. A young miner named Billy Weaver wrote to his mother about the strange silence of the woods at night, a silence so profound it felt heavy, like a blanket smothering a flame. He spoke of the Cherokee guides the company had hired, who refused to stay near the camp after dark, and who would carve strange, protective symbols on the trees at the edge of their perimeter. Another miner, a Welshman named Reese Morgan, wrote to his brother about the foreman Silas Kane. He described Kane as a man possessed, driven by a feverish greed that bordered on madness. Kane pushed the men relentlessly, convinced the devil's vein was just a few feet deeper, a few more blasts away. Morgan wrote that the local Cherokee called the area cursed, a place where the earth held bad memories and did not like to be disturbed. He dismissed it as superstition, but his words carried a nervous undercurrent, a hint of doubt that even a rational mind couldn't entirely suppress in the deep, dark woods of the Smokies. The supply runner was a man named Hank Hasty Miller, a wiry, tobacco-chewing local who knew the mountain trails better than the lines on his own hand. Every 2 weeks, he would make the arduous 2-day journey from the nearest town of Elkmont to Black Creek Camp, his mules laden with salt pork, flour, coffee, and mail. The journey was his ritual, the steady clop of hooves and the rustle of leaves his sermon. In late September of 1911, Hasty Miller made his run as usual. He arrived at the crest of the ridge overlooking the camp just as dusk was painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. And he stopped. A cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. Usually he could hear the camp from a mile away, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the shouts of men, the braying of mules. He could smell the wood smoke from their cook fires. But tonight there was nothing. Only a dead, unnatural silence. The very air seemed to have been stripped of all sound. He spurred his mules forward, his anxiety growing with every step. When he finally broke through the tree line into the camp itself, the scene that greeted him was one of the most disturbing things he had ever witnessed. It wasn't a scene of violence or chaos. It was a scene of absolute, inexplicable stillness. The tents were all standing. A large pot of stew sat over a fire pit, now cold and congealed. A plate of beans and cornbread sat on a stump, a fork still resting in it, as if its owner had simply stood up mid-bite and walked away. Tools were scattered where they had been dropped. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood. Nothing was amiss except for one horrifying detail. All 32 men were gone. They had vanished. Hasty Miller walked through the ghost camp, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He called out names. Silas, Billy, anybody here? His voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence, the words dying in the thick, cold air. He checked each tent. Bedrolls were laid out, personal belongings, letters from home, well-worn Bibles, photographs of wives and children were left untouched. It was as if the men had been plucked from existence in an instant. The very fabric of reality seemed to have torn open and swallowed them whole. The only thing out of place were the carvings. On the central posts of several tents and on the trunks of the ancient trees ringing the camp were the same strange symbols the Cherokee guides had been carving. But these were different. They were carved deeper, more aggressively, as if in a frenzy. And some of them were smeared with a dark, reddish-brown substance that Miller prayed was pine sap or animal blood, but which his gut told him was something far more sinister. He backed away from the camp, the wrongness of the place a physical weight upon him. He didn't linger. He didn't touch anything. He turned his mules around and rode through the night, pushing them harder than he ever had before, not stopping until the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, and he stumbled into the sheriff's office in Elkmont. his face pale and his voice trembling as he told his impossible story. The vanished camp of 32 miners was no longer a secret kept by the mountains. It was now a terrifying public mystery. Sheriff Nathaniel Reed was a practical man, a former soldier who had seen his share of strange and violent things. But the story Hasty Miller stammered out in the pre-dawn gloom of his office was unlike anything he had ever encountered. A whole camp of men gone without a trace. It defied all logic. His first assumption was simple and brutal, a payroll dispute that had turned into a massacre. Perhaps Foreman Kane had tried to cheat the men, and they had killed him and fled. Or maybe Kane himself had slaughtered the crew to keep the location of a rich strike a secret. Another theory was a raid by a rival company, a common enough occurrence in the cutthroat world of prospecting. But Hasty's description didn't fit. A massacre would leave blood, bodies, signs of a fight. A raid would have involved looting the camp for supplies and equipment. But Hasty insisted the camp was pristine, untouched, merely empty. The sheriff assembled a posse of 10 deputized men, hardened loggers and hunters who knew the unforgiving terrain. Their mission was twofold: find the missing miners, and if they couldn't be found, find out what had happened to them. They set out from Elkmont at midday, a grim procession heading into the deep green heart of the Smokies. The mood was tense. The story of the silent, empty camp had already begun to spread, and with it, the old, dark tales of the mountains began to stir from their slumber. Stories of strange creatures, of places where the land itself was hostile to man, of curses laid by the Cherokee on those who disturbed sacred ground. The rational men of the posse scoffed at such tales, but as the shadows lengthened and the forest closed in around them, even the most skeptical among them couldn't shake a growing sense of foreboding. They were walking into a story that was already ancient, and they were about to become its newest, most horrified chapter. The journey to Black Creek Camp took the sheriff's posse a full day and a half. The trail was rough, and the mountains seemed to resist their passage, throwing up obstacles of fallen trees and swollen creeks. When they finally arrived, they found the camp exactly as Hasty Miller had described it: eerily silent, perfectly preserved, a macabre time capsule of the moment 32 men had ceased to be. Sheriff Reed conducted a methodical search. His men went through every tent, cataloging belongings, searching for any note, any clue that could explain the mass disappearance. They found nothing. The men's wages, stored in a lockbox in Silas Kane's tent, were untouched. This fact alone dealt a heavy blow to the theory of a robbery or a dispute over pay. Why would anyone kill 32 men and leave behind a small fortune? The congealed stew over the cold fire pit was examined. It was simple venison and root vegetables, nothing to suggest it had been poisoned. The posse spread out, searching the immediate woods around the camp in a grid pattern. They were looking for tracks, for signs of a struggle, for graves. They found none. The leaf-strewn ground seemed undisturbed, as if the men had simply floated away on the wind. It was during this search that one of the deputies made the first truly disturbing discovery. About 100 yards from the camp, tucked away behind a rock outcropping, was the camp's small forge and blacksmithing area. And on the anvil, laid out with an almost surgical precision, were several personal items belonging to the miners: a pocket watch, a silver locket, and a wedding band. All of them had been smashed flat with a heavy hammer, deliberately and methodically destroyed. The discovery of the crushed personal effects sent a fresh wave of dread through the posse. This was no simple disappearance. This was an act of calculated malice. Why destroy such intimate, personal objects? It felt symbolic, a ritualistic obliteration of the men's identities, their connections to the outside world. It suggested an enemy who didn't just want the miners gone, but wanted them erased. Sheriff Reed now faced a chilling reality. This was not a case of men getting lost or abandoning their post. This was a crime scene. But it was a crime scene unlike any he had ever seen, one with no victims, no suspects, and no apparent motive. The posse spent 2 more days scouring the area, their search growing more desperate. They followed Black Creek upstream and downstream for miles. They climbed the surrounding ridges, firing their rifles into the air, hopping for an answer that never came. The silence of the mountains was their only reply. It was on the third day that they found the mine entrance. It was a dark, narrow shaft shored up with heavy timbers, cut into the side of a steep hill about a half-mile from the camp. And it was here that the mystery deepened into something truly horrifying. The entrance to the mine had been deliberately collapsed. Tons of rock and earth had been brought down, sealing the shaft completely. It wasn't a natural cave-in. The scorch marks and splintered rock pointed to a massive dynamite charge. Someone had gone to great and very dangerous lengths to seal whatever or whoever was inside. The sealed mine shaft became the new, terrifying focus of the investigation. The immediate, sickening thought was that the 32 miners were inside, buried alive. Had there been a catastrophic accident, and a lone survivor had sealed the mine in a grief-stricken panic? Or was it something more sinister? Had the men been forced inside and then entombed by an unknown enemy? The posse was equipped for tracking, not for excavation. Clearing the collapsed mineshaft would require a large crew and heavy equipment from the Appalachian Ore and Timber Company, a process that would take weeks, if not months. Sheriff Reed left 2 deputies to guard the site, with strict instructions not to let anyone near it. He and the rest of the posse returned to Elkmont, their faces grim. The news of the sealed mine sent a shockwave through the small mountain communities. The story was now a full-blown sensation, a macabre tale of buried men and a silent, empty camp. The company, facing a public relations nightmare and the potential loss of their entire investment, was forced to act. They dispatched their top engineer, a man named Elias Thorne, along with a crew of 50 specialized workers, to begin the grim task of reopening the mine. As this large crew began its slow, arduous journey into the mountains, whispers and rumors intensified. The local Cherokee spoke of an old legend, a story that had been banned from being told to outsiders. It was the tale of the Uctina, a great horned serpent that lived deep within the earth. They said that those who disturbed its lair would not just be killed, their very spirits would be consumed, leaving nothing behind. It was a story the modern world had forgotten, but in the shadow of the silent camp, it felt chillingly relevant. As the excavation crew slowly made their way towards the collapsed mine, the first official search parties, organized by the company and local authorities, began a wider sweep of the surrounding wilderness. For weeks, they combed the dense forests and treacherous ridges, a small army of men battling the unforgiving terrain. But the mountains held their secrets close. They found nothing. No bodies, no graves, no shred of clothing, not a single footprint that could be definitively linked to the missing men. It was as if the 32 miners had been erased from the landscape itself. It was during this fruitless search that a different kind of story began to emerge, pieced together from fragments of gossip and the reluctant testimony of those who lived on the fringes of the forest. They spoke of Silas Kane, the foreman. He hadn't just been driven by greed. In the weeks leading up to the disappearance, he had become paranoid and secretive. He had stopped the bi-weekly supply runs for a full month prior to Hasty Miller's final trip, claiming the men had all they needed. He had reportedly threatened a local hunter who had strayed too close to the camp, warning him that what they were digging for was not for outside eyes. This cast a dark new shadow over the mystery. Was this an internal matter? Had Kane discovered something so valuable or so dangerous that he had taken extreme measures to protect it, measures that had backfired catastrophically? The sealed mine was no longer just a potential tomb. It was a potential treasure chest or a Pandora's box, sealed for a terrifying reason. If you find these forbidden histories as compelling as we do, consider subscribing to our channel. The story of Black Creek Camp is a descent into a darkness that is far from over, and you won't want to miss the horrifying truths that are about to be unearthed. The excavation of the Black Creek mine was a monumental undertaking. The crew, under the direction of Elias Thorne, worked around the clock, using steam-powered winches and brute force to haul away tons of rock and shattered timber. The air was thick with coal dust and the metallic tang of suspense. Every man on that crew felt the weight of the 32 souls presumed to be lying just beyond the rockfall. As they dug deeper, a strange and unsettling atmosphere began to pervade the site. Workers complained of hearing faint sounds from within the sealed mine, a low, humming vibration that seemed to resonate deep in the rock, and at night, what some swore was the faint, rhythmic sound of tapping. Morale plummeted. Several men, local hires who grew up with the dark folklore of the region, simply walked off the job, muttering about disturbing bad ground and waking things that should be left to sleep. Thorne, a man of science and engineering, dismissed these as the products of overactive imaginations and exhaustion. But even he couldn't deny the oppressive feeling that hung over the site, the sense that they were not merely opening a mine, but violating a tomb. After nearly 3 weeks of relentless labor, they broke through. The moment the final barrier of rock was cleared, a wave of foul, stagnant air rushed out of the mineshaft, a putrid exhalation that sent the workers reeling. It was the smell of damp earth, rotted timber, and something else, something vaguely organic and deeply unpleasant. With lanterns held high, Elias Thorne and Sheriff Reed, who had returned to oversee the breakthrough, were the first to step inside. The interior of the mine was a landscape of absolute devastation. The initial dynamite blast had been immense, far larger than necessary to simply seal the entrance. It had collapsed the first 100 feet of the main tunnel, creating a chaotic jumble of splintered support beams and shattered rock. It was clear that whoever set the charge wanted this mine sealed permanently and catastrophically. Thorne and Reed led a small party deeper into the darkness, their lantern beams cutting feeble paths through the oppressive gloom. Water dripped from the ceiling, each drop echoing like a ticking clock. The air was thick and hard to breathe. They moved slowly, carefully, their eyes scanning the debris for any sign of the missing miners. They expected to find bodies. They were prepared for a gruesome, heartbreaking discovery. But as they pushed deeper, past the initial collapse and into the stable sections of the mine, a new and more profound horror began to dawn on them. The mine was empty. There were no bodies, no crushed remains in the rockfall, no skeletons lying where they fell. The mine carts were still on their tracks, some half filled with raw, unprocessed ore. Pickaxes and shovels were leaned against the walls or lay on the ground, dropped in the middle of a task. Just like the camp above, the mine was a perfectly preserved scene of sudden, inexplicable abandonment. The 32 miners were not here. They had not been buried alive. The horrifying, mind-bending question returned, now louder and more insistent than ever. If the men weren't in the camp and they weren't in the mine, then where in God's name were they? The empty mine was a stunning, terrifying blow to the investigation. It obliterated the primary theory and left a vacuum of pure, unadulterated mystery. Why seal a mine with such destructive force if no one was inside? Was it meant to conceal something else? Elias Thorne, the engineer, began a thorough examination of the mine itself, and he found something that baffled him. The copper vein the men had been following was rich, certainly, but it was not the legendary Devil's Vein of myth. It was a solid, profitable find, but hardly the kind of discovery that would warrant a massacre or a massive cover-up. However, as he inspected the rock being pulled from the deepest parts of the mine, he noticed strange geological anomalies. Streaks of a black, glassy mineral he couldn't identify were shot through the copper ore. The rock itself felt strangely warm to the touch, even in the cool, damp air of the mine. Furthermore, the miners' drill bits and pickaxe heads showed an unusual amount of wear and corrosion, as if they had been digging through something far harder and more caustic than ordinary rock. Thorne took samples of the strange ore and the surrounding rock, packing them carefully for analysis back in Knoxville. He had a growing suspicion that the men of Black Creek Camp had stumbled upon something far more complex than a simple copper deposit. He didn't know what it was, but the immense effort taken to seal the mine suggested that someone, perhaps Silas Kane himself, believed it was worth killing for, or dying to keep hidden. With the mine proving to be an empty tomb, Sheriff Reed was back at square one. The official search was scaled down, the company grew impatient, and the world began to move on. The mystery of the vanished camp was on the verge of becoming just another cold case, another piece of macabre Appalachian folklore. But Reed couldn't let it go. The image of the silent camp, the crushed wedding band on the anvil, the violently sealed mine, it all pointed to a deliberate human act of profound evil. He turned his attention back to the periphery, to the people who lived in the shadow of the mountains. He began re-interviewing the local Cherokee. Initially, they were reluctant to speak, their distrust of the white authorities running as deep as the mountain roots. But Reed was persistent and, unlike many of his contemporaries, respectful. He eventually earned the trust of an elder named Samuel Flying Bear. Samuel told him the story that had been banned. He spoke of the place where the camp was built, a place his people had avoided for generations. It was, he said, an unbalanced place, where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of spirits was thin. He said that digging into the earth there was like cutting into the flesh of a sleeping god. He spoke of the Spearfinger, a shape-shifting witch-like figure from legend with a stone finger she used to pierce the livers of her victims, but he also spoke of something else, a human darkness. He told the sheriff about a small, isolated clan of families living deep in the mountains, a group that had shunned both Cherokee and white society for centuries. They were known as the Ridge Walkers, and they were said to guard the old places, practicing forbidden rituals and reacting with extreme violence to any outsiders who trespassed on their territory. The legend of the Ridge Walkers opened a new, disturbing avenue for the investigation. These were not mythical spirits or supernatural monsters. They were flesh and blood people, driven by a fanaticism to protect their ancestral lands. According to Samuel Flying Bear, the Ridge Walkers viewed all mining and logging as a violent desecration. They had been linked to a number of mysterious disappearances and unsolved acts of sabotage against logging operations in the region for decades, but their existence was always dismissed by authorities as fearful rumor-mongering. No one had ever managed to find their settlements, which were said to be hidden in the most inaccessible parts of the mountains, in box canyons and hidden valleys. Could this shadowy, isolationist clan be responsible for the disappearance of 32 men? It seemed almost impossible. How could a small group of mountain dwellers, armed with little more than hunting rifles and knives, overwhelm and abduct an entire camp of hardened miners without leaving a single sign of a struggle? It didn't make sense. And yet, the alternative, that the men had simply walked away from their wages and belongings and vanished into thin air, made even less. Sheriff Reed, armed with this new, albeit folkloric, lead, began trying to find evidence of this mysterious clan's existence. He scoured old county records, looking for land deeds or census data in the remote regions described by the Cherokee elder. He found nothing. It was as if the Ridge Walkers, much like the miners they may have hunted, did not officially exist. They were ghosts on the landscape, a human mystery as deep and impenetrable as any supernatural curse. While Sheriff Reed chased rumors of a mysterious mountain clan, the investigation in Knoxville took a scientific, and equally strange, turn. Elias Thorne delivered the ore samples from the Black Creek mine to a geology professor at the University of Tennessee. The initial findings were perplexing. The black, glassy mineral shot through the copper ore was identified as pitchblende, a highly radioactive uranium-bearing mineral. In 1911, the full, terrifying potential of radioactivity was only beginning to be understood by the world's top physicists. To a geologist in Tennessee, it was a scientific curiosity, but one with known and hazardous properties. Prolonged exposure could cause severe burns, sickness, and according to some fringe theories, mental aberrations, paranoia, and violent psychosis. Suddenly, a new, horrifying theory began to take shape. What if the men of Black Creek Camp hadn't been attacked by an external force at all? What if the enemy was the very rock they were digging from the earth? What if weeks of breathing in radioactive dust in a poorly ventilated mine shaft had slowly driven the men, particularly their fanatical foreman Silas Kane, to the brink of madness? It could explain Kane's increasing paranoia and secrecy. It could explain a sudden, violent outburst that consumed the entire camp. It was a terrifying thought, a massacre sparked not by greed or hatred, but by a poison seeping from the ancient rock itself, driving 32 men to turn on one another in a psychotic frenzy. The radiation poisoning theory was compelling, but it had one major flaw. It didn't explain the missing bodies. If the miners had slaughtered each other in a fit of madness, where were the remains? Surely such a chaotic, violent event would have left a scene of utter carnage at the camp or in the mine. Yet both locations were found to be disturbingly clean, with no evidence of a struggle. The theory also failed to explain who would have been left to seal the mine with such explosive expertise after the massacre was over. A single, lone survivor, driven mad by radiation and grief. It seemed unlikely. The puzzle was becoming more complex, its pieces refusing to fit together. Sheriff Reed was now juggling three wildly different, yet equally disturbing, possibilities. First, the supernatural, that the miners had fallen victim to a curse or a malevolent entity awoken by their digging, a theory supported by Cherokee folklore and the sheer inexplicability of the event. Second, the human enemy, that the miners were ambushed and abducted by the mysterious Ridge Walkers, a secretive clan defending their territory. And third, the internal collapse, that the men, poisoned by the very earth they were mining, had descended into a collective madness and destroyed themselves, with the final, horrifying details of their demise somehow erased from the scene. Each theory was more horrifying than the last, and none of them could account for all the facts. The mystery of Black Creek Camp was no longer a simple case of missing persons. It was a philosophical horror story, a riddle that challenged the very nature of logic and reason. The winter of 1911-1912 descended on the Smoky Mountains, blanketing the landscape in a thick shroud of snow and ice. The search for the miners was officially called off until the spring. The sealed mine remained under guard, but the camp itself was abandoned to the elements, its empty tents slowly collapsing under the weight of the snow. The story, once a headline grabber, began to fade from the newspapers, replaced by newer, more immediate tragedies. But for the families of the 32 missing men, there was no moving on. They were left in a state of suspended agony, a limbo of not knowing whether to mourn their dead or pray for their return. A memorial service was held in Elkmont, but it was a hollow affair, with 32 empty caskets serving as a stark, heartbreaking symbol of the void the men had left behind. The Appalachian Ore and Timber Company, facing financial ruin from the failed expedition and a barrage of lawsuits from the families, declared bankruptcy in the spring of 1912. In a stroke of what some called convenience and others called conspiracy, a fire broke out in their Knoxville headquarters shortly after, destroying most of their corporate records, including detailed geological surveys and all employment files for the men of Black Creek Camp. The last official links to the miners, their histories, their next of kin, the precise location of the mine they had dug, were turned to ash. The erasure was now almost complete. The men were not just gone, it was as if they had never been. It was this bureaucratic erasure and the fatting of public memory that drove Jedediah Stone into the Forbidden Woods in the autumn of 1912. Jedediah's younger brother, Daniel, had been one of the 32 miners at Black Creek Camp. While the world gave up, Jedediah could not. He was a man of the mountains, and he knew that the wilderness, for all its dangers, did not simply swallow 32 healthy men without leaving a trace. He spent that summer and fall living off the land, systematically searching the vast, unforgiving wilderness quadrant by quadrant, far beyond the official search areas. He was looking for anything the authorities might have missed. He spoke with old hunters and reclusive herbalists, gathering whispers of local lore. He learned of the Ridge Walkers and of the Spearfinger, and of the places where the rocks themselves were said to be sick. He was not looking for a rational explanation. He was looking for an answer, any answer to the gnawing question that had consumed his life. And so, when he stumbled into that macabre clearing and saw the first bleached femur, It was not with shock, but with a sense of grim, soul-crushing finality. He had found his brother. He had found them all. The mystery of where the miners had gone was solved. But the discovery of their scattered, processed bones opened up a new, and infinitely more disturbing question. Who or what had done this to them? Jedediah Stone did not go to the sheriff. His trust in authority had been eroded by months of inaction and incompetence. Instead, he returned to Elkmont and sought out the only two men he believed might understand the true horror of what he had found: Elias Thorne, the company engineer, and Samuel Flying Bear, the Cherokee elder. He brought them together in a clandestine meeting in the back room of a quiet boarding house. There, by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, he described the bone field. He described the scattered, shattered remains. And he described the most horrifying detail of all: the clean, parallel gouges on the bones, the unmistakable marks of a machine. Thorne, the man of science, went pale. He immediately understood the implication. Those marks were not from any animal's teeth or any primitive tool. They were the signature of an industrial process. The thought was so monstrous, so far beyond the pale of human depravity, that he could barely bring himself to voice it. The men of Black Creek Camp had been put through some kind of machinery. The Cherokee elder listened in stoic silence, his face a mask of ancient sorrow. When Jedediah finished, Samuel Flying Bear spoke a single, chilling sentence in his native Tsalagi before translating it for the two white men. "The Uktena has many forms," he said. "Sometimes it is a serpent of the earth, and sometimes it is a serpent in the heart of man." The unholy trinity of Jedediah, Thorne, and Samuel Flying Bear decided to return to the site together in secret. They knew that if the sheriff's office got involved now, the scene would become a spectacle, and the subtle, terrifying clues might be trampled and lost forever. They journeyed back into the mountains, a grim and unlikely posse. Thorne brought his engineer's toolkit and a scientific eye. Samuel brought his deep knowledge of the land and its dark history. Jedediah brought the fierce, burning rage of a grieving brother. When they arrived at the bone field, Thorne immediately went to work examining the remains. He confirmed Jedediah's horrifying observation. The marks on the bones were consistent with those made by a rock crusher or a stamping mill, machinery used to break down large pieces of ore. But the main ore processing equipment was supposed to be back at the company depot, miles away. The camp had only been equipped for prospecting, for digging and hauling, not for full-scale processing. So where had the machine come from? As Thorne examined the bones, Samuel Flying Bear circled the clearing, his eyes not on the ground but on the trees, the rocks, the flow of the land. He noted that the clearing was not natural. The trees had been felled long ago, but not by loggers. He pointed to faint, almost invisible depressions in the earth, patterns that suggested heavy objects had once rested there. He followed a barely perceptible trail leading away from the clearing, a path where the ground was still compacted, even after a year of weather. Samuel's trail led them on a half-mile trek through dense woods, ending at the edge of a steep, rocky ravine. And there, at the bottom of the ravine, they found it. It was the rusted, mangled wreckage of a portable, steam-powered rock crusher. It was not a large industrial model, but a smaller, more mobile version sometimes used in remote prospecting operations to test the quality of ore on site. It was a piece of equipment that had not been on the official inventory for Black Creek Camp. It had been brought here, to this remote location, secretly, and it had been intentionally destroyed, pushed into the ravine to be hidden from the world. Elias Thorne scrambled down the treacherous slope to inspect the wreckage. The machine was shattered, its heavy iron jaws broken, but even through the rust and damage, he could see the dark, indelible stains. He ran his hand along the inside of the crushing mechanism, and his fingers came away with a greasy, dark residue mixed with what looked like bone dust. The horror of it was absolute and breathtaking. The miners hadn't been killed and then brought to this machine. This machine, this monstrous iron beast, had been the instrument of their deaths. They had been fed into it. It was an act of industrial-scale desecration, a methodical, mechanical process of human destruction so cold and so complete it defied comprehension. Who would do this? And for God's sake, why? The discovery of the secret rock crusher shattered every existing theory. A supernatural beast did not need a machine. The Ridge Walkers, a primitive clan, would not have possessed such equipment, nor the expertise to operate it. The radiation madness theory collapsed under the weight of such methodical, organized brutality. This was the work of a human intelligence, a cold, calculating, and ruthlessly efficient intelligence. This was murder. This was a massacre, executed with the chilling logic of an assembly line. Standing over the rusted machine in the ravine, a terrible new narrative began to form in Elias Thorne's mind. He remembered the secrecy of Silas Kane. He remembered the missing company records. He remembered the pitchblende, the radioactive ore. What if the devil's vein was real, but it wasn't copper? What if Kane, a veteran prospector, had recognized the pitchblende for what it was, not just a geological curiosity, but a source of radium, an element that in 1911 was the most valuable substance on Earth, worth vastly more than gold or diamonds. The Curies had made it famous, and its supposed miraculous medical properties had created a global frenzy. A rich vein of uranium ore would have been a discovery of unimaginable value, a discovery worth killing to protect. A discovery worth erasing 31 witnesses to keep secret. The new theory was as simple as it was monstrous. Silas Kane, the foreman, had found his fortune, but he was isolated, deep in the wilderness, with a crew of 31 men who were all entitled to a share, men who could talk. So he had devised a plan of unimaginable evil. He must have had a secret partner, someone on the outside with access to the rock crusher. Perhaps someone high up in the Appalachian Ore and Timber Company itself, which would explain the convenient fire that destroyed the records. Together, they had hatched a plot. The partner would secretly transport the rock crusher to a predetermined location near the camp. Then, under some pretense, Kane would have lured his men, perhaps in small groups, away from the camp to the hidden site. What happened next is the stuff of nightmares. One by one, or group by group, the miners were murdered and their bodies disposed of in the most efficient, horrifying way possible. Fed into the machine, their bones and flesh ground into a slurry that could be washed away by the creek, leaving only the larger, scattered fragments that Jedediah had found. It explained the lack of a struggle at the camp. The camp wasn't the crime scene. It was merely the staging area. The crushed personal items on the anvil were a final, symbolic act of depravity, a message to anyone who might find them that these men were not just dead, but unmade. And the sealed mine, it was the final act of the cover-up. It wasn't to hide bodies, but to hide the prize, the priceless vein of pitchblende, waiting for Kane and his conspirator to return for it later, after the dust had settled and the 32 miners were nothing but a forgotten ghost story. It was a perfect, horrifying theory. It fit every piece of the puzzle. The foreman's paranoia, the secret equipment, the destroyed records, the lack of bodies at the camp, the deliberately sealed mine, and the machine-processed remains. Elias Thorne now believed he knew what had happened, but knowing and proving were two different things. Who was Kane's partner? How could they ever prove it? Their secret investigation had hit a wall of pure, unadulterated evil, a wall built by a ghost. Silas Kane was, of course, presumed to be one of the 32 victims. His name was on the list of the dead. But what if he wasn't? What if the 32nd victim was a fiction? What if Kane had staged his own disappearance, murdered his entire crew, and simply walked away, a very, very rich man? It was a chilling thought. He would be out there, somewhere, living a new life, his fortune built on the ground-up bones of the men who had trusted him. Jedediah Stone refused to accept this. His brother had been murdered, and he would not rest until there was some form of justice. Armed with Thorne's theory, the three men made a pact. They would bring this evidence to Sheriff Reed, but they would do it carefully. They knew that a story this monstrous, accusing a respected company and its foreman of a crime this unspeakable, would be met with disbelief and ridicule without irrefutable proof. Their only proof was a rusted machine in a ravine and a field of machine-marked bones, a truth so macabre it sounded like fiction. When Sheriff Reed was led to the bone field and the rusted rock crusher, He did not react with disbelief. He had lived with this case for over a year, and the sheer strangeness of it had prepared him for a bizarre conclusion. But even he was not prepared for this. The sight of the machine-gnawed bones and the stained jaws of the crusher filled him with a cold, professional rage. This was a new depth of inhumanity he had never imagined. He immediately deputized Thorne and Jedediah and swore them to secrecy. He knew this investigation could not be done by the book. The conspiracy likely reached high up into the company, and any public move would tip off their suspect, if he was even still in the country. Reed's new investigation became a shadow war. He started a discreet background search for Silas Kane, not as a victim, but as a fugitive. He sent telegraphs to law enforcement in other mining states, Colorado, Nevada, California, looking for any sign of a man matching Kane's description who had come into a sudden, unexplained fortune. He had Thorne create a detailed engineering report on the rock crusher, documenting its likely origin and the nature of the stains found within it. This was no longer about finding missing persons. It was about hunting a monster. A monster who had worn a human face and had commanded the trust of 31 men before leading them to a mechanical, grinding death. Months turned into years. The secret investigation yielded nothing. Silas Kane had vanished as completely as his crew. No man matching his description ever surfaced. The hypothetical partner within the Appalachian Ore and Timber Company was never identified. The company's bankruptcy and the fire that destroyed its records had provided the perfect cover. The case grew colder, the trail fainter, until it was little more than a whisper of frost on a winter window. The bone field was eventually, and quietly, cleaned up by the sheriff's department. The remains of the 32 men were gathered and buried in a single, unmarked mass grave in the Elkmont Cemetery, their final resting place as anonymous as their final moments were horrifying. The official cause of death for all 32 miners, including Silas Kane, was listed as death by misadventure at the hands of person or persons unknown. It was a vague, bureaucratic epitaph for one of the most monstrous mass murders in American history. The story of Black Creek Camp became a forbidden legend, a tale too dark and too disturbing to be told in polite company. The location of the mine, the camp, and the bone field were deliberately omitted from official records, allowed to be swallowed once more by the indifferent green of the Great Smoky Mountains. The curse, it seemed, was real after all, but it wasn't a curse of the earth. It was the ancient, insatiable curse of human greed. Elias Thorne, haunted by what he had discovered, left the engineering profession and became a recluse. He could no longer look at a machine without seeing the rusted, stained jaws of the rock crusher in the ravine. Jedediah Stone lived out his days in the mountains, a quiet, solitary man, his brother's ghost a constant companion. Sheriff Reed retired a few years later, the vanished camp case the one great, dark failure of his career. The story lived on only in whispers, a chilling campfire tale told by locals, each generation adding a new layer of supernatural dread to the story because the truth, the cold, mechanical, human truth, was simply too horrifying to contemplate. The pitchblende, the radioactive ore that had sparked the massacre, was left where it lay, its immense value and deadly properties a secret kept by a handful of dead men and the silent, watchful mountains. But the story does not quite end there. There is one final, macabre postscript, a disturbing loose end that only serves to deepen the chilling ambiguity of this entire affair. It is a detail that hints at a darkness even deeper than Silas Kane's greed, a darkness that connects back to the very first whispers of folklore that surrounded the camp. It suggests that while the monster may have been human, he may not have been acting entirely alone. In 1934, over 2 decades after the disappearance, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park was established. As the government began buying up land and surveying the remote wilderness, a civilian Conservation Corps crew was tasked with blazing new trails in the same long-abandoned region as the former Black Creek Camp. Deep in the woods, miles from any known settlement, they stumbled upon the ruins of a small, isolated homestead, a collection of crude log cabins, long since collapsed. It was not a place that appeared on any map. As they cleared the area, they found a small family burial plot. The graves were marked with simple, hand-carved wooden headstones, the names and dates long since eroded by time. But one grave was different. It was marked with a professionally carved granite headstone, a stone that would have been expensive and difficult to transport so deep into the wilderness. The name on the headstone was weathered but still legible. It read, Silas Kane. And the date of death was listed as October 2nd, 1911, just days after the estimated date of the miner's disappearance. Underneath the name was a strange, carved symbol. It was the same symbol that had been found carved into the trees around the empty camp. The discovery of Silas Kane's grave, deep in the territory rumored to belong to the Ridge Walkers, was a bombshell that threw the entire accepted theory of the massacre into chaos. If Kane had died just days after his men, then he couldn't have been the mastermind who escaped with a fortune. He was just another victim. But who had killed him, and who had given him a proper burial with an expensive headstone, a sign of respect, while his men were turned to dust and scattered in a forgotten clearing? The presence of the strange symbol, the one linked to local protective rituals, on his grave was deeply unsettling. It suggested a connection between Kane and the shadowy inhabitants of the mountains. A new, and perhaps even more horrifying, narrative emerges from this discovery. What if Silas Kane had not been acting alone, but had formed an unholy alliance with the Ridge Walkers? Perhaps he had promised them a share of the mine's wealth in exchange for their help in removing his crew. The Ridge Walkers, with their intimate knowledge of the forest and their ruthless methods, would have been the perfect accomplices for such a brutal task. They could have helped lure the miners to their doom, operated the machinery, and then melted back into the wilderness, leaving no trace. But in this version of the story, there was a double cross. After the massacre was complete and the crew was eliminated, the Ridge Walkers, true to their isolationist beliefs, turned on the final outsider, Silas Kane himself. They killed him, but for some unknown reason, they gave him a burial, marking his grave as a warning or a tribute. This final twist adds a layer of folk horror to the cold case of industrial murder. It suggests a confluence of two distinct forms of evil, the modern, greedy evil of an industrialist, and the ancient, territorial evil of a reclusive, violent clan. Kane, in his greed, may have thought he could control the darkness he had aligned himself with, only to be consumed by it in the end. It explains everything and nothing at once. It provides a possible fate for Kane, but it deepens the mystery of the Ridge Walkers, a people who could commit such an atrocity and then, bizarrely, honor one of their victims. Why the headstone? Was it a trophy, a sign of a pact fulfilled, or did Kane have a deeper connection to them than anyone ever knew? Perhaps he was not an outsider to them at all. We will likely never know. The authorities in 1934, busy with the creation of a national park, did not exhume the grave. The report on its discovery was filed away and forgotten. The location of the homestead, like the mine and the camp before it, was lost to time as the forest reclaimed its own. The story of the vanished camp of 32 miners remains a cold case, perhaps the most disturbing and macabre in the long, dark history of the Appalachian Mountains. A story of a massacre so complete, it nearly erased its own evidence from existence. If you're captivated by these deep dives into the most unsettling and forbidden corners of history, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on. We are dedicated to unearthing the stories that have been deliberately buried, because the truth, no matter how horrifying, deserves to be told. Today, the forests of the Great Smoky Mountains are a place of immense beauty, visited by millions of tourists a year. They hike the manicured trails, take photographs of the scenic vistas, and camp under the stars, completely unaware of the horrifying history that lies just beneath the surface of the soil. Somewhere out there, deep off the marked paths, in a place forbidden by folklore and forgotten by history, lies the overgrown scar of a mineshaft sealed with dynamite, hiding a vein of radioactive rock that drove men to madness and murder. Somewhere nearby, the forest floor is still seeded with the fine, powdered dust of human bone, the last mortal remnants of 31 men who were fed to a machine. And somewhere, in a tangle of roots and shadow, a single granite headstone may still stand, a silent, cryptic monument to a monster who was himself consumed by a darkness he could not control. The story is a chilling reminder that the wilderness holds more than just natural dangers. It holds human secrets, and sometimes, the most terrifying monsters are the ones who walk on two legs, their hearts filled with a greed as cold and as hard as the rock they seek to plunder. The silence that Hasty Miller encountered at the camp in 1911 was not an absence of sound. It was the sound of an ending, the sound of a story that had been brutally and permanently concluded. The vanished camp of 32 miners serves as a horrifying lesson in human depravity, a tale where the lines between greed, madness, and ancient folklore blur into a single, cohesive nightmare. Was it the simple, brutal calculus of a man like Silas Kane, willing to liquidate his entire workforce for a vein of radioactive ore? Or did the poison of the pitchblende seep into his mind, twisting his ambition into a homicidal psychosis? Or, in the most chilling possibility of all, did he form a pact with the shadowy, violent guardians of the mountains, the Ridge Walkers, unleashing a force he could not comprehend and ultimately falling victim to his own monstrous plot? The final piece of evidence, the grave of Silas Kane, denies us the simple comfort of a single villain. It suggests a conspiracy, a double cross, a web of darkness with roots running far deeper than a simple mining operation. It leaves us with the unsettling image of two distinct worlds of evil colliding, the cold, industrial avarice of the modern world and the primal, ritualistic violence of an older, hidden one. They met at Black Creek Camp, and their union resulted in an act of annihilation so perfect, it almost succeeded in wiping itself from the historical record entirely. The only things that remain are the scattered, machine-scarred bones and the enduring, horrifying legend they left behind. The ultimate truth of what happened in the Smoky Mountains in 1911 remains buried, a cold case locked in a tomb of earth and time. There are no deathbed confessions, no discovered journals, no definitive proofs to light the way. There is only the chilling progression of discoveries, an empty camp, a sealed mine, a field of processed bones, a rusted machine, and a single, enigmatic grave. Each new piece of the puzzle only serves to make the final picture more macabre and more disturbing. It is a story with no heroes, only victims and villains, and even the line between those two is terrifyingly blurred. The Appalachian Ore and Timber Company is gone. The miners are gone. Silas Kane is gone. And the Ridge Walkers, if they ever truly existed, have remained ghosts in the forest. All that is left is the silence. The same profound, predatory silence that greeted a terrified supply runner over a century ago. It lingers there still, in the deep hollows and on the fog-shrouded ridges. It is a silence heavy with memory, a testament to an act of horror so absolute that the land itself still holds its breath, forever guarding the forbidden, horrifying secret of the vanished camp and the 32 miners who were not just murdered, but utterly and completely erased.